Have you heard the story of the man who made a rash promise to God, only to realize it would cost him his greatest treasure? In a moment of desperation, he vowed to offer the first thing that greeted him when he returned home. What he didn't expect was for his own daughter to walk through the door. What drove him to make such a fateful decision, and what can we learn from his heartbreaking story? Hello and welcome to Unveil Biblical Mysteries. Now let's get on with our biblical story. Once upon a time, there was a man whose desperate decision would change the course of his life forever. A man who made a promise to God that led to a tragic and heart-wrenching outcome. His name was Jephthah, and he was known as a mighty warrior, but his story is not one of glorious victories on the battlefield. Instead, it is the tale of a rash vow that resulted in an unimaginable sacrifice, his own daughter. Jephthah was no stranger to rejection. Born the son of a harlot, he was driven out by his half-brothers and left to live as an outcast. But when trouble came knocking on Israel's door in the form of the Ammonites, they turned to the very man they once despised, begging him to lead them into battle. The stakes were high. Victory seemed impossible, and Jephthah knew he needed divine intervention. So, in a moment of desperation and perhaps fear, he made a vow to God, "If you give me victory over the Ammonites, I will sacrifice as a burnt offering whatever comes out of my house to greet me when I return." At first glance, it seemed like a noble promise, offering something valuable in return for God's favor. But Jephthah, blinded by his desire for victory, didn't consider the consequences. As he marched into battle, the Lord delivered the Ammonites into his hands. Victory was his. Jephthah returned home, triumphant and filled with joy. But that joy was short-lived. As he approached his home, it wasn't an animal or a servant that ran out to greet him. No, it was his one and only daughter, his pride and joy, dancing and playing tambourines in celebration of her father's victory. In that moment, Jephthah's heart sank. The vow he had made to God now hung like a heavy chain around his neck. He had promised to offer whatever came out of his house as a burnt offering, and it was his daughter who came running out to meet him. Torn between his love for his daughter and his oath to God, Jephthah was faced with an unbearable decision. What could he do? Could he break his vow to God, or would he follow through with the unimaginable? This is only the beginning of Jephthah's tragic story. Stay with us as we uncover the devastating consequences of his rash promise and the lessons we can learn from this ancient tale. What would you have done in Jephthah's shoes? And why did such a story find its way into the pages of the Bible? The answers will surprise you. Jephthah stood frozen, unable to believe his eyes. His heart pounded, and a cold sweat covered his brow. His only daughter, the one who had been the light of his life, was now the center of his darkest nightmare. She ran to him, full of joy, completely unaware of the terrible vow that hung over her like a shadow. The vow he had made to God. He tore his clothes in anguish, a sign of deep sorrow in ancient times. His voice trembled as he spoke, "Oh, my daughter! You have brought me down, and I am devastated. I made a vow to the Lord, and I cannot break it." The joy in her eyes faded as the weight of his words settled in. She understood what her father was saying. She knew what the vow meant. Yet, to everyone's surprise, she didn't cry out in anger or fear. Instead, she looked at her father and said, "My father, you have given your word to the Lord. Do to me just as you promised, for the Lord has avenged you of your enemies, the Ammonites." Her bravery was almost unimaginable. In that moment, she wasn't just Jephthah's daughter. She became a symbol of obedience and sacrifice. But was this really what God wanted? Had Jephthah misunderstood the heart of the God he served? Before we get to the heart of the story, Let's pause for a moment. What would you do in Jephthah's shoes? The weight of his vow crushed him. He was bound by his own words, but was it right to sacrifice his daughter? You might be wondering if this tragic vow could have been avoided, or if there's more to this story. Could Jephthah have found a way out? And why would God allow such a promise to be made in the first place? Jephthah's daughter made one final request, something that would give her time to process her fate. But before we get into that, let's consider the broader picture. Was Jephthah's vow truly in line with what God expected from him? As we continue this story, we will explore her courageous request, the meaning behind her response, and how the people of Israel remembered this moment for generations to come. But here's the question that lingers. Did Jephthah really need to fulfill his vow? Stay tuned as we dive deeper into the story of Jephthah, a man trapped by his own words and the mystery behind a promise that changed everything. As the days passed, Jephthah's daughter returned home, her heart heavy but resolute. She had spent 2 months in the hills, reflecting on her fate and creating cherished memories with her friends. Now, she stood before her father, ready to face the reality of his vow. "Father," she said, her voice steady, "I'm ready for what lies ahead. But please, remember me. Let the women of Israel mourn for me every year, for I will never marry." Jephthah felt a wave of emotions wash over him. He was proud of her strength, yet his heart ached with the weight of his promise. He had vowed to offer whatever came out of his house first as a burnt offering to God, and now he faced the tragic consequences of that vow. The Bible tells us that Jephthah prepared an altar and gathered the necessary materials, burdened by the choice before him. As he stood there, a deep sense of conflict filled his heart. Was this truly what God wanted? Could there be another way? In the end, the Bible does not explicitly state what happened next. It leaves us with a haunting ambiguity. Did Jephthah fulfill his vow as promised, or was there a way he honored God without sacrificing his daughter? The narrative suggests that he did offer her, but it is not clearly defined. What we do know is that this story serves as a powerful lesson about the weight of our promises and the importance of thoughtful choices. Jephthah's story reminds us that our decisions can have far-reaching consequences, and we must be careful with the vows we make. As we reflect on this tale, we are left with a choice: to consider the impact of our own promises and the legacies we create. In the end, Jephthah's daughter became a symbol of courage, and her story continues to resonate through generations, urging us to think deeply about the commitments we make in life. In this powerful story of Jephthah, we learn the importance of being mindful of the promises we make, especially to God. His vow, made in haste, led to heartbreaking consequences that serve as a cautionary tale for us today. It teaches us that our words and commitments carry great weight, and we must be wise in our decisions. Jephthah's daughter, with her grace and courage, also reminds us of the strength found in facing difficult situations with dignity. Though the Bible leaves us uncertain about her fate, the lessons of faith, sacrifice, and the lasting impact of our choices are clear. If you found this video insightful, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss more biblical stories that challenge, inspire, and help us grow in wisdom. Share your thoughts on Jephthah's story in the comments below.